In that clip from The Truman Show, our hero comes crashing into the limitations of his old world. And that's the theme for this week's The Weekly Strategy Memo. I'm Rich Tafel, president of RLT Strategies, and each week I answer a question from a world-changing leader. And this week's question comes from Jill in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She asks, what is the future of the U.S. engaging internationally on philanthropy in this time of economic belt-tightening, and what suggestions do you have for people who are interested in working internationally? Well, Jill, you would naturally think that with record deficits, with the fatigue from war, and with the budget tightening we're hearing in the United States, that there would be a lot less funding for international spending for aid. And if you thought that, you'd be wrong. In fact, in the president's budget last week, he doubled the amount of aid the United States will be giving out internationally. You've heard Secretary Clinton talking about smart power. What she's referring to is the use of foreign aid. So actually, we could be in a period where aid could increase in spending. So that's the good news in answer to your question. Here's the more complicated answer. First, 2/3 of all that money that we give away in aid goes to just 3 countries. And the biggest chunk of that spending also goes to weapons. So when we hear aid, it doesn't necessarily mean what you might think in international aid, that it's going to go to agriculture, food for the hungry, building houses for the homeless. So that's the first thing. A lot of that is already spoken for. The second thing is we have an expression here in Washington called Beltway bandits. And those are contractors who get the funds from the federal government. And they have special relationships to get contracts. For a nonprofit working, for example, in Argentina, you'd probably have to subcontract with one of those contractors to get the aid. So it's a little bit more complicated. Now, you asked for suggestions. Let me give you a few suggestions. I wouldn't be depending on U.S. government aid for the work that you're trying to do in Latin America. With all of my clients, I suggest a strategy that is like a stool with 3 completely different legs. A financial advisor would tell you in this market is a good time to diversify your portfolio. I'd suggest the same thing to someone who's trying to do world-changing work around the world. Now, what are the 3 legs to this stool? Think of them as 3 P's. The first is policy, the second is public funding, and third is private funding. Let me explain what the 3 mean. Policy is what we've been talking about. That's money from government. And that doesn't just mean the U.S. government. It could be in a government of the country where you're working in, or also many of the European countries have aid budgets. So that's public. That's policy. Public is when you're working with nonprofits. And believe it or not, most of the money that comes from our country actually comes through this sector, the public sector, through foundations and nonprofits. Americans are much more likely to give a check people to people than they will through their government. And the third, most neglected, is private funding, and that's corporations. That's the most neglected by people doing work out in the field. I recently was working with a nonprofit leader in Latin America, actually, and suggested working with corporations to get funding for the program. His response? I didn't get into the nonprofit world to work with the enemy, business. That's exactly the wrong attitude. To really accomplish world-changing goals, you need to think in all 3 terms: policy, public funding, and private funding. Bring them all together, and you can accomplish real world change, and you can be like the character in the movie who crashed into a wall of his expectations, and it turned out to be a door to new opportunity. And this is Rich Tafel with the Weekly Strategy Memo. I look forward to your questions and your feedback.